There is a generation that nobody talks about. Not the boomers, they get blamed for everything. Not the millennials, they get analyzed for everything. Not Gen Z, they get memed for everything. No, this generation sits in the middle. Quiet, overlooked, getting on with it. They are Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980. Raised in an era of divorce, latchkey childhoods, economic instability, and a world that was changing faster than anyone could explain. They didn't get participation trophies, they didn't get helicopter parents. They didn't get safe spaces. They got a house key at age 8, instructions to be home by dark, and a world that largely left them to figure things out on their own. And they did, but what did that do to them psychologically? What does it actually mean to grow up the way Gen X grew up, and how does that shape the way they think? The way they work, the way they love, and the way they see a world that has spent 30 years ignoring them. That is what we are going to talk about today. And if you are Gen X, I promise you by the end of this video, you are going to feel seen in a way you probably haven't in a very long time. Let's go, part 1. The world that made them. To understand Gen X psychology, you have to understand the world they grew up in. Because generations are not shaped by the years they were born. They are shaped by what happened to them during their most formative years, roughly ages 5 to 18, when the brain is most plastic, most impressionable, and most deeply wired by experience. And what happened to Gen X during those years was a lot. The 1970s were not the golden era of optimism that had defined their parents' boomer childhoods. The Vietnam War had shattered the myth of American invincibility. Watergate had destroyed trust in institutions. The oil crisis had created economic panic. Inflation was eating people's savings, and divorce, once rare, once stigmatized, was suddenly everywhere. By the time Gen X children were in elementary school, the divorce rate in America had roughly doubled from what it had been a generation before. 1 in 2 marriages was ending, and Gen X were the children sitting in the middle of that statistic. Then came the 1980s, the Reagan era, the decade of excess, of AIDS, of nuclear anxiety, of the crack epidemic. The first generation to grow up with the genuine, daily awareness that the world could end at any moment, and the first generation to see that awareness treated by adults as simply something you lived with. They watched their parents work harder and longer in jobs that were becoming less secure. They came home to empty houses while both parents worked. They raised themselves in many cases, or they raised their younger siblings. This is the soil that Gen X psychology grew from, not trauma in the dramatic, visible sense, but a quiet, chronic exposure to instability that taught one lesson above all others. You cannot rely on the world to take care of you, you have to take care of yourself. Part 2, the Latchkey psychology. There is a specific term for what shaped so many Gen X children. The latchkey kid, the child who came home from school to an empty house, who let themselves in with the key around their neck, who made their own snack, did their own homework, managed their own afternoon, and figured out what to do if something went wrong because there was nobody home to ask. Researchers who have studied this cohort describe something consistent and striking. These children developed what psychologists call premature autonomy, a level of self-sufficiency and independent functioning that was developmentally ahead of schedule. Not because they were exceptional, but because circumstances demanded it. And premature autonomy leaves a mark. It produces adults who are extraordinarily capable of functioning independently, who do not panic when left to their own devices, who can figure things out, manage uncertainty, and handle situations that would paralyze people who had more hand-holding growing up. But it also produces adults who find it deeply difficult to ask for help, who interpret needing support as weakness, who have an almost allergic reaction to being told what to do because the entire formation of their identity happened in the absence of authority telling them what to do. Gen X does not like being managed. Gen X does not like being lectured. And Gen X absolutely does not need your validation, not because they are arrogant, but because they built themselves from scratch in rooms where nobody was watching, and they know, at a bone-deep level, that they are capable of figuring it out. Part 3. The psychological profile. Let's get specific about what the research and the lived experience actually tells us about how Gen X thinks and operates. The first trait, radical self-reliance. This is the defining characteristic. Gen X does not wait to be rescued. They do not expect systems to work in their favor. They built a fundamental orientation toward life that says, if something needs to happen, I will make it happen. This is not the inspirational self-reliance of a motivational poster. This is the practical, unglamorous, daily self-reliance of someone who learned early that waiting for help is a waste of time. The second trait, deep skepticism of institutions. Gen X watched Watergate as children or heard it from parents who were shaken by it. They watched the Catholic Church scandal unfold. They watched corporations downsize and eliminate the pensions their parents had been promised. They watched government after government make promises and deliver something else entirely. And they drew the logical conclusion: don't trust the institution. Trust the individual, trust the person in front of you who has earned it, not the system that claims to represent something. This skepticism is sometimes read as cynicism, but it is more precise than cynicism. It is not the belief that everything is bad. It is the hard-won refusal to believe something simply because an authority figure said it. The third trait, dark humor as a coping mechanism. Gen X invented irony as a generational language. Where boomers used optimism and millennials use sincerity, Gen X uses the dry, deadpan acknowledgement that things are often absurd, frequently unfair, and best faced with a joke that doesn't fully disguise the pain underneath. This is not emotional avoidance. It is emotional intelligence operating at a specific frequency, the frequency that says, I see how bad this is, I am not pretending otherwise. And I am going to find the part of it that I can laugh at because that is how I stay sane. The fourth trait, adaptability. Gen X entered the workforce in the era before the internet. They adapted to the internet, they adapted to smartphones. They adapted to social media. They adapted to every technological and cultural shift that followed, not because they were enthusiastic about change, but because adapting is what they do. They are the generation that bridges the analog and digital worlds completely. The last generation that knows what life was like before, and the first to fully function in what came after. This makes them extraordinarily versatile in ways that neither boomers nor millennials fully are. The fifth trait, emotional restraint. Gen X does not tend to perform their feelings. They do not process publicly, they do not post about their emotional journey. They do not generally expect the world to care about their inner state. This was modeled for them. Their parents' stoic, practical post-war did not emote openly. And Gen X absorbed that template. The result is a generation that feels things deeply, that has been through enormous amounts of personal and collective difficulty, but that shows relatively little of it on the surface. Which leads directly to what is perhaps the most important and least understood fact about Generation X. Part 4. The silent exhaustion. Nobody checks in on Gen X. That is not an exaggeration. It is a documented pattern. When researchers study generational well-being, Gen X consistently reports some of the highest levels of stress, financial pressure, and emotional exhaustion while simultaneously receiving the least attention, the least cultural acknowledgement, and the least support of any adult age cohort. They are the sandwich generation in the most complete sense. Many of them are simultaneously raising children and caring for aging parents, carrying the weight of two generations while still trying to manage their own careers, finances, and lives. They entered the workforce during recessions. They built financial stability only to watch it partially erased by the 2008 financial crisis. They are now facing retirement in an era where retirement has become significantly less certain than it was for the generation before them. And through all of it, they do not complain, not loudly, not publicly. Because that is not how they were built to handle it. And so they handle it. And because they handle it so quietly, the people around them, their children, their parents, their employers, their culture, assume they're fine. They are often not fine, they are just very, very practiced at functioning while not being fine. Part 5, Gen X AT Work. Let's talk about how this psychology translates into the workplace. Because this is where Gen X has been the most misunderstood and the most undervalued. Gen X workers are not flashy, they do not need to be praised in public. They do not need a corporate culture that treats the office like a family. They do not need foosball tables and Friday happy hours and mission statements about changing the world. They need clarity, autonomy, and to be left alone to do their job. Give a Gen X employee a clear objective and the space to achieve it, and they will achieve it. Micromanage them, hold unnecessary meetings, question their methods, or require them to perform enthusiasm for the company's values, and you will lose them. Physically or psychologically, you will lose them. Research on Gen X workplace preferences consistently shows the same priorities: independence, competence-based respect, work-life balance, and managers who trust them enough to step back. They are not the generation that confuses professional achievement with personal identity. They watched their boomer parents sacrifice everything for careers that were ultimately not loyal to them. They drew the lesson: they work hard, they work effectively. But they know that the job is not who they are. This is sometimes read as lack of ambition. It is actually a form of psychological sophistication that took their parents decades to develop, if they developed it at all. Part 6: What Gen X gave the world here is what the cultural narrative almost never acknowledges. Generation X built the world you are currently living in. The internet that you use every day was developed, commercialized, and scaled primarily by Gen X entrepreneurs and engineers. Jeff Bezos, Gen X; Elon Musk, Gen X; Sergey Brin and Larry Page, Gen X. The founders of YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, Gen X. These are not people who were handed opportunity and ran with it. These are people who built opportunity from scratch during recessions. Without the generational wealth that boomers accumulated, and without the digital native fluency that Gen Z was born into. They figured it out because that is what they do. Beyond technology, Gen X reshaped popular culture in ways that are still felt everywhere. They created grunge, hip-hop's golden era, independent film. And a form of cultural commentary, smart, ironic, deeply aware of contradiction, that became the template for everything that followed. They wrote the books, they directed the films. They created the art of a generation that had something real to say because they had actually lived through something real. And then they handed the cultural microphone to the next generation and went back to work. Quietly, without making it about them. Part 7: A direct message to Gen X. This part is for you. The ones who grew up too fast and never quite got to finish growing up. The ones who came home to empty houses and figured it out. The ones who watched the institutions fail and adapted anyway. The ones who are right now at this moment, holding together a job and a family and aging parents and financial stress and a world that keeps demanding more, and are doing it with the particular brand of quiet, unpraised competence that your generation does better than any other. I want to say something to you directly: you were never forgotten by the people who mattered. You were forgotten by the noise, by the cultural machinery that always found boomers more dramatic and millennials more marketable, and Gen Z more entertaining. But the work you did, the quiet, consistent, unglamorous work of keeping things running, of building things that lasted, of showing up without being asked and handling things without being thanked, that work is real. It mattered, it still matters. And the psychological toughness you built not by choice but by necessity, that toughness has costs. Real ones: the difficulty asking for help, the exhaustion of always being the capable one. The loneliness of a generation that prides itself on needing nothing and sometimes, in the quiet moments, needs everything. You are allowed to need things, you are allowed to say that it's been hard. You are allowed to put something down, not permanently, not forever. Just long enough to remember that the version of you that exists outside of what you can handle, that person is also real. And that person deserves to be seen, even if you've spent your entire life making sure nobody had to worry about you. Outro: Generation X is the generation that raised itself. And in doing so, it built something the world rarely gives them credit for: a psychological resilience, a practical intelligence, and a clear-eyed view of reality that is, quietly, one of the most valuable things any generation has produced. They are not the loudest, they are not the most celebrated, but they are the ones who, when everything falls apart, and it does fall apart, it always falls apart, you want in the room. Because they have been in the room before, they know what to do. And they will do it without making a fuss. That is Gen X, understated, underrated, and more important than the world has ever taken the time to say. If you are Gen X, share this with someone who finally needs to understand you. If you love someone who is Gen X, show this to them. And then, maybe for the first time, ask them how they are actually doing. And wait for the real answer. Leave a comment below. Are you Gen X? What part of this hit closest to home? I read every single one. Subscribe for new psychology content every week. Until next time, you've been handling it long enough. Take a breath, you earned it.